Talk. The Crimean War. 1853 to 1854. He, Burke, maintained that the attempt to bring the Turkish Empire into the consideration of the balance of power in Europe was extremely new, and contrary to all former political systems. He pointed out in strong terms the danger and impolity of our espousing the Ottoman cause. Burke, 1791. After the session, Mr. Gladstone had gone on a visit to Dunrobin, and there he was laid up with illness for many days. It was the end of September before he was able to travel south. At Dingwall they presented him, September 27, with the freedom of that ancient burg. He spoke of himself as having completed the 21st year of his political life, and as being almost the youngest of those veteran statesmen who occupied the chief places in the councils of the Queen. At Inverness the same evening, he told them that in commercial legislation he had reaped where others had sown, that he had enjoyed the privilege of taking a humble but laborious part in realizing those principles of free trade which, in the near future, would bring, in the train of increased intercourse and augmented wealth, that closer social and moral union of the nations of the earth which men also fervently desire, and which must in the fullness of time lessen the frequency of strife and war. Yet even while the hopeful words were falling from the speaker's lips, he might have heard, not in far distance but close at hand, the trumpets and drums, the heavy rumbling of the cannon, and all the clangor of a world in arms. 2. Ottomans and the West. One of the central and perennial interests of Mr. Gladstone's life was that shifting, intractable, and interwoven tangle of conflicting interests, rival peoples, and antagonistic faiths, that is veiled under the easy name of the Eastern Question. The root of the Eastern Question, as everybody almost too well knows, is the presence of the Ottoman Turks in Europe, their possession of Constantinople, that incomparable center of imperial power standing in Europe but facing Asia, and their sovereignty as Mahometan masters over Christian races. In one of the few picturesque passages of his eloquence, Mr. Gladstone once described the position of these races. They were like a shelving beach that restrained the ocean. That beach, it is true, is beaten by the waves, it is laid desolate, it produces nothing, it becomes perhaps nothing save a mass of shingle, of rock, of almost useless seaweed. But it is a fence behind which the cultivated earth can spread, and escape the incoming tide, and such was the resistance of Bulgarians, of Servians, and of Greeks. It was that resistance which left Europe to claim the enjoyment of her own religion and to develop her institutions and her laws. This secular strife between Ottoman and Christian gradually became a struggle among Christian powers of northern and western Europe, to turn tormenting questions in the East to the advantage of rival ambitions of their own. At a certain epoch in the 18th century, Russia first seized her place among the powers. By the end of the century she had pushed her force into the west by the dismemberment of Poland, she had made her way to the southern shores of the Black Sea, and while still the most barbaric of all the states, she had made good a vague claim to exercise the guardianship of civilization on behalf of the Christian races and the Orthodox Church. This claim it was that led at varying intervals of time, and with many diversities of place, plea, and color, to crisis after crisis springing up within the Turkish Empire, but henceforth all of them apt to spread with dangerous contagion to governments beyond Ottoman limits. England, unlike France, had no systematic tradition upon this complicated struggle. When war began between Russia and the Porte in 1771, we supported Russia and helped her to obtain an establishment in the Black Sea. Towards the end of 1782, when Catherine, by a sort of royal syllogism, as Fox called it, took the Crimea into her own hands, the Whig cabinet of the hour did not think it necessary to lend Turkey their support, though France and Spain proposed a combination to resist. Then came Pitt. The statesman whose qualities of greatness so profoundly impressed his contemporaries has usually been praised as a minister devoted to peace, and only driven by the French Revolution into the long war. His preparations in 1791 for a war with Russia on behalf of the Turk are a serious deduction from this estimate. Happily, the alarms of the Baltic trade, and the vigorous reasoning of Fox, produced such an effect upon opinion, that Pitt was driven, on peril of the overthrow of his government, to find the best expedient he could to bring the business to an end without extremities. In 1853 the country was less fortunate than it had been in 1791. A Russian diplomatist made a homely comparison of the Eastern question to the gout: now its attack is in the foot, now in the hand, but all is safe if only it does not fly to a vital part. In 1852 the Eastern question showed signs of flying to the heart, and a catastrophe was sure. A dispute between Greek and Latin religious as to the custody of the holy places at Jerusalem, followed by the diplomatic rivalries of their respective patrons, Russia and France, produced a crisis that was at first of no extraordinary pattern. The quarrel between two packs of monks about a key and a silver star was a trivial symbol of the vast rivalry of centuries between powerful churches, between great states, between heterogeneous races. The dispute about the holy places was adjusted, but was immediately followed by a claim from the Tsar for recognition by treaty of his rights as protector of the Sultan's Christian subjects. This claim the Sultan, with encouragement from the British ambassador, rejected, and the Tsar marched troops into the Danubian provinces, to hold them and pledge until the required concession should be made to his high protective claims. This issue was no good cause for a general conflagration. Unfortunately many combustibles happened to lie about the world at that time, and craft, misunderstanding, dupery, autocratic pride, democratic hurry, combined to spread the blaze. Diplomatic rivalries. The story is still fresh. With the detailed history of the diplomacy that preceded the outbreak of war between England, France, and Turkey on the one part and Russia on the other, we have here happily only the smallest concern. The large question, as it presented itself to Mr. Gladstone's mind in later years, and as it presents itself now to the historic student, had hardly then emerged to the view of the statesmen of the Western powers. Would the success of Russian designs at that day mean anything better than the transfer of the miserable Christian races to the yoke of a new master, 296, or was the repulse of these designs necessary to secure to the Christian races, who, by the by, were not particularly good friends to one another, the power of governing themselves without any master, either Russian or Turk? To this question, so decisive as it is in judging the policy of the Crimean War, it is not quite easy even now for the historian, who has many other things to think of than has the contemporary politician, to give a confident answer. Nicholas was not without advisers who warned him that the breakup of Turkey by force of Russian arms might be to the deliverer a loss and not a gain. Brunnow, then Russian ambassador at St. James's, said to his sovereign, the war and its results would cause to spring out of the ruins of Turkey all kinds of new states, as ungrateful to us as Greece has been, as troublesome as the Danubian principalities have been, and an order of things where our influence will be more sharply combated, resisted, restrained, by the rivalries of France, England, Austria, than it has ever been under the Ottoman. War cannot turn to our direct advantage. We shall shed our blood and spend our treasure in order that King Otho may gain Thessaly, that the English may take more islands at their own convenience, that the French too may get their share, and that the Ottoman Empire may be transformed into independent states, which for us will only become either burdensome clients or hostile neighbors. If this forecast was right, then to resist Russia was at once to prevent her from embarrassing and weakening herself, and to lock up the Christians in their cruel prison house for a quarter of a century longer. If sagacious calculation in such a vein as this were the mainspring of the world, history would be stripped of many a crimson page. But far-sighted calculation can no longer be ascribed to the actors in this tragedy of errors, to Nicholas or Napoleon, to Aberdeen or Palmerston, or to any other of them excepting Cavour and the Turk. In England both people and ministers have been wont to change their minds upon the Eastern question. In the war between Russia and Turkey in 1828, during the last stage of the struggle for Greek independence, Russia as Greek champion against the Turk had the English populace on her side. Palmerston was warmly with her, regarding even her advance to Constantinople with indifference, and Aberdeen was reproached as a Turkish sympathizer. Now we shall see the parts inverted, England and Palmerston ardent Turks, and Aberdeen falling into disgrace, unjustly enough, as Russian. Before we have done with Mr. Gladstone, the popular will be found to make another and yet another revolution. 3. The British Cabinet. When Kinglake's first 2 volumes of his History of the Crimean War appeared, 1863, Mr. Gladstone wrote to a friend, May 14, Kinglake is fit to be a brilliant popular author, but quite unfit to be a historian. His book is too bad to live, and too good to die. As to the matter most directly within my cognizance, he is not only not too true, but so entirely void of resemblance to the truth, that one asks what was really the original of his picture. 297, a little earlier he had written to Sir John Acton, I was not the important person in the negotiation before the war that Mr. Kinglake seems to suppose, and with him every supposition becomes an axiom and a dogma. All the papers from various sources to which I have had access show that Mr. Gladstone, as he has just said, had no special share in the various resolutions taken in the decisive period that ended with the abandonment of the Vienna Note in the early autumn of 1853. He has himself told us that through the whole of this critical stage Lord Clarendon, then in charge of foreign affairs, was the centre of a distinct set of communications, first, with the Prime Minister, next, with Lord John Russell as leader in the Commons, and third, with Lord Palmerston, whose long and active career at the Foreign Office had given him special weight in that department. The Cabinet as a body was a machine incapable of being worked by anything like daily and sometimes hourly consultations of this kind, the upshot of which would only become known on the more important occasions to the ministers at large, especially to those among them charged with the most laborious departments. 298. This was not at all said by way of exculpating Mr. Gladstone from his full share of responsibility for the war, for of that he never at any time showed the least wish or intention to clear himself, but rather the contrary. As matter of fact, it was the 4 statesmen just named who were in effective control of proceedings until the breakdown of the Vienna Note, and the dispatch of the British and French squadrons through the Dardanelles in October, opened the second stage of the diplomatic campaign, and led directly if not rapidly to its fatal climax. We have little more than a few glimpses of Mr. Gladstone's participation in the councils of the eventful months that preceded the outbreak of the war. To Mrs. Gladstone he writes, October 4th I can hardly at this moment write about anything else than the Turkish declaration of war. This is a most serious event, and at once raises the question, are we to go into it? The Cabinet meets on Friday, and you must not be surprised at anything that may happen. The weather may be smooth, it also may be very rough. First the smooth weather came. October 7th. We have had our Cabinet, 3 hours and a half, all there but Graham and Molesworth, 299, who would both have been strongly for peace. We shall have another tomorrow, to look over our results in writing. Some startling things were said and proposed, but I think that as far as government is concerned, all will probably keep straight at this juncture, and as to war I hope we shall not be involved in it, even if it goes on between Russia and Turkey, which is not quite certain. Aberdeen himself thought the aspect of this Cabinet of the 7th on the whole very good, Gladstone arguing strongly against a proposal of Palmerston's that England should enter into an engagement with Turkey to furnish her with naval assistance. Most of the Cabinet were for peace. Lord John was warlike, but subdued in tone. Palmerston urged his views perseveringly but not disagreeably. The final instruction was a compromise, bringing the fleet to Constantinople, but limiting its employment to operations of a strictly defensive character. This was one of those peculiar compromises that in their sequel contain surrender. The step soon showed how critical it was. Well indeed might Lord Aberdeen tell the Queen that it would obviously every day become more and more difficult to draw the line between defensive and offensive, between an auxiliary and a principal. So much simpler is a distinction in words than in things. Still, he was able to assure her that, though grounds of difference existed, the discussions of the Cabinet of the 8th were carried on amicably and in good humor. With straightforward common sense the Queen pressed the Prime Minister for his own deliberate counsel on the spirit and ultimate tendency of the policy that he would recommend her to approve. In fact, Lord Aberdeen had no deliberate counsel to proffer. Speedily the weather roughened. Speech at Manchester. 4 days later, October 12, the Minister repeated that, while elements of wide difference existed, still the appearance of that day was more favorable and tended to mutual agreement. At this cabinet Mr. Gladstone was not present, having gone on an expedition to Manchester, the first of the many triumphal visits of his life to the great industrial centres of the nation. Nothing, he wrote to Lord Aberdeen, could have gone off better. Yesterday, October 11th, I had to make a visit to the Exchange, which was crammed and most cordial. This morning we had first the inauguration of the Peel statue, in the presence of an enormous audience, misnamed so, inasmuch as but a portion of them could hear, and then a meeting in the town hall, where there were addresses and speeches made, to which I had to reply. I found the feeling of the assemblage so friendly that I said more on the war question than I had intended, but I sincerely hope I did not transgress the limits you would think it wise for me to observe. The existence of a peace and a war party was evident, from alternate manifestations, but I think the former feeling was decidedly the stronger, and at any rate I should say without the smallest doubt that the feeling of the whole meeting as a mass was unequivocally favourable to the course that the government have pursued. Your Manchester speech, Lord Aberdeen wrote to him in reply, has produced a great and, I hope, a very beneficial effect upon the public mind, and it has much promoted the cause of peace. This result was extremely doubtful. The language of the Manchester speech is cloudy, but what it comes to is this. It recognizes the duty of maintaining the integrity and independence of the Ottoman Empire. Independence, however, in this case, says Mr. Gladstone, designates a sovereignty full of anomaly, of misery, of difficulty, and it has been subject every few years since we were born to European discussion and interference. We cannot forget the political solecism of Mahometans exercising despotic rule over 12 millions of our fellow Christians. Into the questions growing out of this political solecism we are not now entering. What we see today is something different. It is the necessity for regulating the distribution of power in Europe, the absorption of power by one of the great potentates of Europe, which would follow the fall of the Ottoman rule, would be dangerous to the peace of the world, and it is the duty of England, at whatever cost, to set itself against such a result. This was Mr. Gladstone's first public entry upon one of the most passionate of all the objects of his concern for 40 years to come. He hears the desolate cry, then but faint, for the succor of the oppressed Christians. He looks to European interference to terminate the hateful solecism. He resists the interference single-handed of the northern invader. It was intolerable that Russia should be allowed to work her will upon Turkey as an outlawed state. 300. In other words, the partition of Turkey was not to follow the partition of Poland. What we shortly call the Crimean War was to Mr. Gladstone the vindication of the public law of Europe against a wanton disturber. This was a characteristic example of his insistent search for a broad sentiment and a comprehensive moral principle. The principle in its present application had not really much life in it. The formula was narrow, as other invasions of public law within the next dozen years were to show. But the clear-cut issues of history only disclosed themselves in the long result of time. It was the diplomatic labyrinth of the passing hour through which the statesmen of the coalition had to thread their way. The disastrous end was what Mr. Disraeli christened the Coalition War. The first year of the coalition government, Lord Aberdeen wrote to Mr. Gladstone, was eminently prosperous, and this was chiefly owing to your own personal exertions, and to the boldness, ability, and success of your financial measures. Our second year, if not specially brilliant, might still have proved greatly advantageous to the country, had we possessed the courage to resist popular clamor and to avoid war, but this calamity aggravated all other causes of disunion and led to our dissolution. 301. 4. England slowly drawn in. On November 4, Clarendon wrote to Lord Aberdeen that they were now in an anomalous and painful position, and he had arrived at the conviction that it might have been avoided by firm language and a more decided course 5 months ago. Russia would then, as she is now, have been ready to come to terms, and we should have exercised a control over the Turks that is now not to be obtained. Nobody, I suppose, doubts today that if firmer language had been used in June to Sultan and Tsar alike, the catastrophe of war would probably have been avoided, as Lord Clarendon here remorsefully reflects. However that may have been, this pregnant and ominous avowal disclosed the truth that the British cabinet were no longer their own masters, that they had in a great degree, even at this early time, lost all that freedom of action which they constantly proclaimed it the rule of their policy to maintain, and which for a few months longer some of them at least strove very hard but all in vain to recover. The Turks were driving at war whilst we were laboring for peace, and both by diplomatic action and by sending the fleet to protect Turkish territory against Russian attack, we had become auxiliaries and turned the weaker of the two contending powers into the stronger. A few months afterwards Mr. Gladstone found a classic parallel for the Turkish alliance. When Aeneas escaped from the flames of Troy he had an ally. That ally was his father Anchises, and the part which Aeneas performed in the alliance was to carry his ally upon his back. But the discovery came too late, nor was the Turk the only ally. Against the remonstrances of our ambassador the Sultan declared war upon Russia, and proceeded to acts of war, while knowing that England and France in what they believed to be interests of their own would see him through it. If the Sultan and his ulemas and his pashas were one intractable factor, the French Emperor was another. "We have just as much to apprehend," Graham wrote, October 27, "from the active intervention of our ally as from the open hostility of our enemy." Behind the decorous curtain of European concert Napoleon III was busily weaving scheme after scheme of his own to fix his unsteady diadem upon his brow, to plant his dynasty among the great thrones of Western Europe, and to pay off some old scores of personal indignity put upon him by the Tsar. The Tsar fell into all the mistakes that a man could. Emperor by divine right, he had done his best to sting the self-esteem of the revolutionary emperor in Paris. By his language to the British ambassador about dividing the inheritance of the sick man, he had quickened the suspicions of the English cabinet. "It is true the sick man will die," said Lord John Russell, "but it may not be for 20, 50, or 100 years to come, when William III and Louis XIV signed their treaty for the partition of the Spanish monarchy, they first made sure that the death of the king was close at hand. Then the choice as agent at Constantinople of the arrogant and unskillful Menshikov proved a dire misfortune. Finally, the Tsar was fatally misled by his own ambassador in London. Bruno reported that all the English liberals and economists were convinced that the notion of Turkish reform was absurd, that Aberdeen had told him in accents of contempt and anger, "I hate the Turks," and that English views generally as to Russian aggression and Turkish interests had been sensibly modified. All this was not untrue, but it was not true enough to bear the inference that was drawn from it at St. Petersburg. The deception was disastrous, and Bruno was never forgiven for it. 302. Lord Stratford de Redcliffe. Another obstacle to a pacific solution, perhaps most formidable of them all, was Lord Stratford de Redcliffe, the British ambassador at Constantinople. Animated by a vehement antipathy to Russia, possessing almost sovereign ascendancy at the port, believing that the Turk might never meet a happier chance of having the battle out with his adversary once for all, and justly confident that a policy of war would find hearty backers in the London cabinet, in him the government had an agent who, while seeming to follow instructions in the narrow letter, baffled them in their spirit. In the autumn of 1853 Lord Aberdeen wrote to Graham, "I fear I must renounce the sanguine view I have hitherto taken of the Eastern question, for nothing can be more alarming than the present prospect. I thought that we should have been able to conquer Stratford, but I begin to fear that the reverse will be the case, and that he will succeed in defeating us. Although at our wits' end, Clarendon and I are still laboring in the cause of peace, but really to contend at once with the pride of the Emperor, the fanaticism of the Turks, and the dishonesty of Stratford is almost a hopeless attempt." 303. This description, when he saw it nearly 40 years later, seems to have struck Mr. Gladstone as harsh. Though he agreed that the passage could hardly be omitted, he confessed his surprise that Lord Aberdeen should have applied the word dishonesty to Lord Stratford. He suggested the addition of a note that should recognize the general character of Lord Stratford, and should point out that prejudice and passion, by their blinding powers, often produce in the mind effects like those proper to dishonesty. 304. Perhaps we may find this a hard saying. Doubtless when he comes to praise and blame, the political historian must make due allowance for his actors, and charity is the grandest of illuminants. Still, hard truth stands first, an amiable analysis of the psychology of a diplomatic agent who lets loose a flood of mischief on mankind is by no means what interests us most about him. Why not call things by their right names? 305. In his private letters, November, Stratford boldly exhibited his desire for war, and declared that the war, to be successful, must be a very comprehensive war on the part of England and France. Well might the Queen say to the Prime Minister that it had become a serious question whether they were justified in allowing Lord Stratford any longer to remain in a situation that enabled him to frustrate all the efforts of his government for peace. Yet here, as many another time in these devious maneuvers, that fearful dilemma interposed, inseparable in its many forms from all collective action whether in cabinet or party, so fit to test to the very uttermost all the moral fortitude, all the wisdom of a minister, his sense of proportion, his strength of will, his prudent pliancy of judgment, his power of balance, his sure perception of the ruling fact. The dilemma here is patent. To recall Lord Stratford would be to lose Lord Palmerston and Lord John. To lose them would be to break up the government. To break up the government would be to sunder the slender thread on which the chances of peace were hanging. 306. The thought, in short, of the high-minded Aberdeen striving against hope to play a steadfast and pacific part in a scene so sinister, among actors of such equivocal or crooked purpose, recalls nothing so much as the memorable picture long ago of Maria Theresa. Beset and baffled by her Kaunitzes and Thuggets, Catherines, Josephs, Great Fredericks, Grand Turks, and wringing her hands over the consummation of an iniquitous policy to which the perversity of man and circumstance had driven her. As the proceedings in the cabinet dragged on through the winter, new projects were mooted. The ground was shifted to what Lord Stratford had called a comprehensive war upon Russia. Some of the cabinet began to aim at a transformation of the policy. It was suggested that the moment should be seized to obtain not merely the observance by Russia of her treaty obligations to Turkey, but a revision and modification of the treaties in Turkish interests. This is the well-known way in which, ever since the world called civilized began, the area of conflict is widened. If one plea is eluded or is satisfied, another is found, and so the peacemakers are at each step checkmated by the warmakers. The powers of Central Europe were immovable, with motives, interests, designs, each of their own. Austria had reasons of irresistible force for keeping peace with Russia. A single victory of Russia in Austrian Poland would enable her to march direct upon Vienna. Austria had no secure alliance with Prussia. On the contrary, her German rival opposed her on this question, and was incessantly canvassing the smaller states against her in respect to it. The French emperor was said to be revolving a plan for bribing Austria out of northern Italy by the gift of Moldavia and Wallachia. All was intricate and tortuous. The view in Downing Street soon expanded to this, that it would be a shame to England and to France unless the Tsar were made not only to abandon his demands, and to evacuate the principalities, but also to renounce some of the stipulations in former treaties on which his present arrogant pretensions had been formed. In the future, the guarantees for the Christian races should be sought in a treaty not between Sultan and Tsar, but between the Sultan and the Five Powers. British opinion. Men in the cabinet and men out of it, some with ardor, others with acquiescence, approved of war for different reasons, interchangeable in controversial value and cumulative in effect. Some believed, and more pretended to believe, that Turkey abounded in the elements and energies of self-reform, and insisted that she should have the chance. Others were moved by vague general sympathy with a weak power assailed by a strong one, and that one, moreover, the same tyrannous strength that held an iron heel on the neck of prostrate Poland, that only a few years before had dispatched her legions to help Austria against the rising for freedom and national right in Hungary, that urged intolerable demands upon the Sultan for the surrender of the Hungarian refugees. Others again counted the power of Russia already exorbitant, and saw in its extension peril to Europe, and mischief to the interests of England. Russia on the Danube, they said, means Russia on the industry. Russia at Constantinople would mean a complete revolution in the balance of power in the Mediterranean, and to an alarmed vision, a Russia that had only crossed the Pruth was as menacing as if her Cossacks were already encamped in permanence upon the shores of the Bosphorus. Along with the anxieties of the Eastern question, ministers were divided upon the subject of parliamentary reform. Some, including the Prime Minister, went with Lord John Russell in desiring to push a reform bill. Others, especially Palmerston, were strongly adverse. Mr. Gladstone mainly followed the head of the government, but he was still a Conservative, and still member for a Tory constituency, and he followed his leader rather mechanically and without enthusiasm. Lord Palmerston was suspected by some of his colleagues of raising the war cry in hopes of drowning the demand for reform. In the middle of December, 1853, he resigned upon Reform 307, but 9 days later he withdrew his resignation and returned. In the interval, news of the Russian attack on the Turkish fleet at Sinope, November 30, had arrived, an attack justified by precedent and the rule of war. But public feeling in England had risen to fever. The French Emperor, in exacting and peremptory language, had declared that if England did not take joint action with him in the Black Sea, he would either act alone or else bring his fleet home. The British cabinet yielded, and came to the cardinal decision, December 22, to enter the Black Sea. I was rather stunned, Gladstone wrote to Sidney Herbert next day, by yesterday's cabinet. I have scarcely got my breath again. I told Lord Aberdeen that I had had wishes that Palmerston were back again on account of the Eastern question. Here is a glimpse of this time. November 23, 53. Cabinet. Reform discussed largely, amicably, and satisfactorily on the whole. December 16. Harden. Off at 9 a.m. astounded by a note from A. Gordon. Palmerston had resigned the day before. After dinner went to the Admiralty, 10½ where Lord Aberdeen, Newcastle, Graham, and I went over the late events and went over the course for tomorrow's cabinet. December 21. Called on Lord Palmerston, and sat an hour. 22. Cabinet, 2-7½ on Eastern question. Palmerston and Reform. A day of no small matter for reflection. January 4, 1854. To Windsor. I was the only guest, and thus was promoted to sit by the Queen at dinner. She was most gracious, and above all so thoroughly natural. The decision of December 22. On the decision of December 22, Sir Charles Wood says, "We had then a long discussion on the question of occupying the Black Sea, as proposed by France, and it seemed to me to be such a tissue of confusions that I advocated the simple course of doing so. Gladstone could not be persuaded to agree to this, in spite of a strong argument of Newcastle's. Gladstone's objection being to our being hampered by any engagement. His scheme was that our occupying the Black Sea was to be made dependent, in the first place, on the Turks having acceded to the Vienna proposals, or at any rate to their agreeing to be bound by any basis of peace on which the English and French governments agreed. Newcastle and I said we thought this would bind us much more to the Turks than if we occupied the Black Sea as part of our own measures, adopted for our own purposes, and without any engagement to the Turks, under which we should be if they accepted our conditions. Gladstone said he could be no party to unconditional occupation, so it ended in our telling France that we would occupy the Black Sea, that is, prevent the passage of any ships or munitions of war by the Russians, but that we trusted she would join us in enforcing the above condition on the Turks. If they agreed, then we were to occupy the Black Sea; if they did not, we were to reconsider the question, and then determine what to do. Clarendon saw Walewski, who was quite satisfied. By the middle of February war was certain. Mr. Gladstone wrote an account of a conversation that he had at this time with Lord Aberdeen. February 22. Lord Aberdeen sent for me today and informed me that Lord Palmerston had been with him to say that he had made up his mind to vote for putting off, without entering into the question of its merits, the consideration of the Reform Bill for the present year. Conversation on Reform. 308. He then asked me whether I did not think that he might himself withdraw from office when we came to the declaration of war. All along he had been acting against his feelings, but still defensively. He did not think that he could regard the offensive in the same light, and was disposed to retire. I said that a defensive war might involve offensive operations, and that a declaration of war placed the case on no new ground of principle. It did not make the quarrel, but merely announced it, notifying to the world, of itself justifiable, a certain state of facts which would have arrived. He said all wars were called or pretended to be defensive. I said that if the war was untruly so called, then our position was false, but that the war did not become less defensive from our declaring it, or from our entering upon offensive operations. To retire therefore upon such a declaration, would be to retire upon no ground warrantable and conceivable by reason. It would not be standing on a principle, whereas any man would require a distinct principle to justify him in giving up at this moment the service of the crown. He asked, how could he bring himself to fight for the Turks? I said we were not fighting for the Turks, but we were warning Russia off the forbidden ground. That if, indeed, we undertook to put down the Christians under Turkish rule by force, then we should be fighting for the Turks, but to this I for one could be no party. He said if I saw a way for him to get out, he hoped I would mention it to him. I replied that my own views of war so much agreed with his, and I felt such a horror of bloodshed, that I had thought the matter over incessantly for myself. We stand, I said, upon the ground that the Emperor has invaded countries not his own, inflicted wrong on Turkey, and what I feel much more, most cruel wrong on the wretched inhabitants of the principalities, that war had ensued and was raging with all its horrors, that we had procured for the Emperor an offer of honorable terms of peace which he had refused, that we were not going to extend the conflagration, but I had to correct myself as to the Baltic, but to apply more power for its extinction, and this I hoped in conjunction with all the great powers of Europe. That I, for one, could not shoulder the musket against the Christian subjects of the Sultan, and must there take my stand. Not even, I had already told him, if he agreed to such a course, could I bind myself to follow him in it. He said Granville and Wood had spoken to him in the same sense. I added that S. Herbert and Graham probably would adhere, perhaps Argyle and Molesworth, and even others might be added. Lord Aberdeen's misgivings.